Masters Academy online. It's organized by Global Quality Leadership Institute, the nonprofit organization whose mission is to become the world leading advocate for quality in technology. The organization will reach this goal through developing innovative programs on software testing and quality for the tech community, leadership, and educational institutions. Testmasters Online is our new educational project. It includes the series of free webinars and Ask the Experts roundtables with the renowned speakers in our testing community. It offers new ideas, knowledge, and opportunity to chat and network with software testers around the world. Our other project is Software Testing Conference Contest NYC on November 14th through 16th in New York. We invite you to discover emergent trends and practices in software testing and quality engineering, lay your hands and eyes on the latest technologies, and immerse yourself into the thought leadership of others in 3 unforgettable days at Contest NYC. Our presenters are senior technologists, managers, and practitioners who are the innovators and experts in their field. The conference is held on November 14th through 16th in 2018 in New York. The link to register is in Testmasters Academy Slack chat. Today we have Todd Cherches with us, and he will be speaking on the topic of presenting with impact and influence. Hello, Todd.
Hi, Vera. Thank you so much. So I'm Todd Cherches. Welcome to Presenting with Impact and Influence. Before we start, I have a confession to make. Watching this video will not make you a better presenter. Sorry to tell you that. The only way to actually become a better presenter is by presenting. So ideally with feedback and coaching. So presenting is a skill like any other skill, whether you're learning to play a sport or a musical instrument or a video game or learning to code or to test software. We only get better at skills through practice and through experience. So the good news is that this webinar will provide you with some valuable tools, tips, and techniques that will help you to present better next time you're up there, whether you're on stage, in a conference room, or doing a webinar like this one. So hopefully after this, you'll have some new ideas and new approaches that will help you to design and deliver more effective presentations. So with that being said, let's get started. So I'd like to make this as interactive as it could be while still being a webinar, and also by being a webinar that some people may be watching later on video rather than live. So first thing I'd like you to do is to think about some of the worst presentations you've ever seen. So give that some thought. What made them so bad? Think about times that you were sitting in an audience saying, this is torture, this is painful, I can't believe they just did that or said that. So we've all been there, we've all seen them, probably more often than we would like. So take about, I don't know, 10 seconds and think about the last really bad presentation or last webinar that you saw or watched. So think about that. If you want to write it down, I actually recommend that if you have a pen and paper nearby or on your digital device, just take some notes, write some things down. So bad presentations. So one is based on this slide right here, just someone talking nonstop without actually saying anything of value. So if you had to guess, what would you guess that the #1 thing is that presentation audiences hate most? I'll give you a hint. So research has shown that among all the different things that annoy audiences at presentations, there's nothing worse than presenters who show bad slides and read them off the screen. So I've been to many presentations like that. So I'm going to give you my top, what I found to be, over my years of doing presentation skills training, the top 5 complaints about presentations. So the first one is text. When you put a slide like this up on the screen, and it's been done, I've seen it, I'm sure you've seen it, it's painful. So, because what happens when this is up on the screen, what are you doing? Are you listening to me right now, or are you reading? Most likely you're reading, right? So if you just look at this one sentence, you're listening to me because there's no distraction, right? So what about now? I'm talking to you right now. This might be what you look like looking at your screen. So again, you're focused on what I'm saying, and you're not just reading ahead of me, because human nature is to just read ahead of the speaker. We could read a lot faster than a speaker can speak. So hopefully you're listening right now, because what you're seeing is just a visual, and we're interacting without the distraction of all that text, right? So one of the things to keep in mind is that slides are not handouts. So it's great to have text. It's great to send people a presentation before or after, but you shouldn't put your notes up on the screen, because again, people are reading and not listening to you. So tip #1 is don't torture us with text, okay? So we've seen it done, we know it's not right, and yet people do it anyway. So Number two is reading off the screen. It's okay to read like a short phrase, like a bullet, like I just did, reading off screen, right? But what you don't want to do is read for extended lengths of time because, again, people just find it really annoying and distracting and demeaning in a way, right? So this is what we don't want to do. So do not cross this line if it comes to you. If this is what your slides look like, great. Cut and paste them into the notes field and read them before you present, but you should have an image up on the screen or just a couple of words, but not this, okay? So otherwise, people are sitting there and this is what they're thinking the entire time that you're presenting to them. So number three is bullet points. So bullet points are better than text, right? Better than paragraphs. So this is a little better than what I previously showed you. But again, you're reading the bullet points. You're not listening to me. So don't do either of those things. Now, so remember this. This is a good mantra to keep in mind. Tip number four, complaint number four, is distracting use of color. Color is great when used with purpose and strategically, but some people do this. They'll say, oh, my black and white slides need some more zip or pizzazz or whatever. I hate that word. I don't know why I even used it. But adding color does not make it any better, right? So same thing with a bullet point list. This, again, it adds some variety, but color needs to have purpose, and this doesn't. This is just variety. So again, something not to do. And the last one is bad visuals in general. So we just said to use visuals and not text, but bad visuals are in some ways even better than no visuals at all. So if I put a visual up like this on the screen, it's great. This was from a magazine, What Annoys Learners Most About PowerPoint, with some statistics. But again, you're probably reading right now. So if I was going to use this information, instead of putting this whole thing up on the screen, I might just put this up on the screen, right? And actually give you a few seconds to process the information rather than doing this, and you're reading ahead of me. So those are 5 things, because I just wanted to stop for a second and say vision trumps all other senses. So if you're seeing something and hearing something, what you see on the screen is going to trump, I hate to use that word either, trump what you are hearing. So those are the top 5 complaints about presentation. So if you're doing any of these things, it's good to find other ways, and that's something that we'll talk about in this webinar. So one of the keys is, as Henry David Thoreau said, is to simplify, simplify, simplify. But if you wanted to simplify that, you could simply say, simplify, right? So make things, as Einstein once said, make things as simple as possible, but no simpler. So we're not talking about dumbing things down, because we're all dealing with very complex subject matter, but how could you simplify it so that your audience will understand it and remember it? That's the most important thing. I love this visual. People who hate bad presentations and those who create them, most of us are in the middle. Why do we do the things that we hate when others do? Very often because we either don't know another way or we don't take the time to figure out another way and actually put together better visuals and better slides and better presentations. So now think about some of the best presentations you've ever seen. What made them good? So take 10 seconds and think about, now you thought about a bad one. What was a good one that you saw, and what was good about it? Was it the presenter? Was it his or her style? Was it their slides? Was it the content? What was it? So well, ideally what we want to do is avoid the things that bad presenters do and emulate and model some of the things that the good presenters do. Now, we talked about other people, but what about you? Think about the last presentation that you gave. What worked? What went well? Even if it bombed, even if you said, oh, that was awful, there must have been something that worked about it, something that you could be proud of, that you could build on, something that went well. But also, and even if it was great, you could say, what could have been better, right? We all have the things that we're working on. Like for me, I'm from New York City, live from New York, coming to you live from New York. My tendency is to talk a little too fast. So I always have to remind myself, slow down, breathe, pause. In fact, I even have this, I'll hold it up right here. I have this seashell straight from the beach that reminds me to be a little more snail-like and slow down my pace a little bit. So I'm going to try to do that starting right now. So it's one thing to go fast, another thing to be rushing and racing. So we'll try not to rush and race, even though we only have an hour. So we promised to pull back the curtain. So having a little fun here with the visuals. We don't want to overdo special effects, but that was just for a little fun. On how to design and deliver more effective presentations so that you can have greater impact and more influence. So I do a lot of presentation skills training. I do leadership training. I teach at NYU and Columbia. I have tons of content, right? So let's say I have 60 hours worth of presentation skills content that I have in my disposal in my arsenal. And yet, for today's webinar, we only have 60 minutes. So what do I do with that? How do I pack 60 hours into 60 minutes? I just can't. No matter how fast I talk, I still can't do it. So you need to think about the constraints. Who's your audience? What's your purpose? What are your time constraints? What am I going to include? But I always say the hardest part about designing any presentation or workshop or class is deciding what to leave out. That's the hard part, because we love what we do. We know so much. We want to share it, but we can't include everything. So what you're going to get today is some of my highlights, some of my favorite tips. Someone has their sound on, so we're getting a little background noise. So I'm just going to mention that. So presenting with impact and influence. Let's start as if we were starting right now, right? So let me just tell you really briefly about myself. My name is Todd Cherches. My company is called Big Blue Gumball. Our motto is to make training entertaining, because boring training doesn't teach anyone anything. And our mantra is to educate, engage, and excite. And I'm going to talk more about that shortly. So Big Blue Gumball, the company name, the Big Blue Gumball represents the world. To us, the world is like a big blue gumball, however you want to take that. And our mission is to help make the world a better place, one leader at a time. And to us, everyone is a leader. And our job is to help you to maximize your performance, productivity, and your potential. So we do leadership development, presentation skills, and executive coaching. And as I mentioned, I'm an adjunct professor at both NYU and Columbia. So I'm also writing my first book right now. It's called Visual Leadership: Leveraging the Power of Visual Thinking and Visual Communication. So that's just a little bit about me, just so you have a little context. Now, let me go back to the 3 E's. Our 3 E's: educate, engage, and excite. This is our company's motto, but you should think about this relative to your presentations, right? Educate. What do you want people to learn and take away from your presentation? Engage. How are you going to capture and hold their attention? And excite. How are you going to inspire them to go out there and do something differently? So whatever you do, I was just actually reading an article in preparation for this, reading this article about shifting, testing left, bakes in quality from the start. The whole idea of, in software development, instead of going analyze, design, develop, test, and release, the idea behind this article was to shift testing to earlier in the process, right? So if I was doing a presentation on this, or if you were, how would you get people educated, telling them why that's a good thing? How are you going to capture and hold their attention by speaking to what's interesting to them? But also, how are you going to motivate them to go out and think about, hey, maybe we should do this. Maybe we should start a movement, whether it's spreading agile methodologies in your organization, whatever it is that you want people to do. How are we going to inspire them to go out and do something different at the end of your presentation? Because presentations are all about inspiring change in other people. If you're not going to try to motivate people to change, then you need to think about what was the point of my presentation. We're going to talk more about that shortly. When you're preparing a presentation, as I prepared for this one, you need to answer these questions, right? Who is your audience, right? Who am I talking to today? What is the presentation about? Presentation skills for people in the testing field. When am I doing it on today's date and time? Where am I doing it? I'm doing it as a webinar as opposed to a presentation on live on stage somewhere. Why are we doing it? Why was I asked to do this presentation? What's the purpose? And then how I deliver the presentation will be based on the who, what, when, where, and why. So it's great to just run through these questions. If I'm meeting with a new client who says, I want to do leadership training, I always do this with them. I say, let's go through the who, what, when, where, why, and then we'll determine the how. So that's a great tip to keep in mind. This is our master model. For the rest of this session, we have 45 minutes left. We're going to focus on this model and each of the 5 phases. So we want to think about what's the purpose of your presentation, who's your audience, and then the 3 legs of the stool, right? So like a stool, if it only has 2 legs or 1, it's going to tip over. The 3 legs of your presentation stool are your content is the first leg, your presentation design is the second leg, and your delivery is the 3rd leg. So let's start with purpose, right? Who knows what this is? Think about it for a second. This is, you're going to throw up, you're going to gag when you hear this, but this is the purpose of your presentation. Or I'll let that sink in for a second. Really cheesy, but I guarantee you will never forget it. So think about what is the purpose, let me fix the typo, what is the purpose of your presentation, right? You need to think about why you're doing it. If you don't have a reason, then you probably shouldn't be doing it at all. Every presentation needs a purpose. So why does your presentation exist, and what are you trying to accomplish, right? Those are the questions to ask yourself. So if you think about what your purpose is, let's say your purpose is to educate, engage, and excite. I need to inform people, capture their attention, and motivate them to act, right? You need to ask the question so that what? you want to educate, engage, and excite them so that they do what? What do you want your audience to think, feel, know, and do during and after your presentation? And the most important one is what? Is the do, right? You want people to actually take an action. We say you need to have a call to action at the end of your presentation so that people actually do something differently. So the purpose of this webinar is what? To provide the test masters community with a variety of tools, tips, and techniques that will help you to design and deliver more effective presentations, right? That's the purpose of this webinar. Everything I talk about today will focus on this purpose. If it doesn't fit this purpose, then it shouldn't be in this presentation. So that's a good thing to think about as you're preparing your next presentation. What's your purpose? Can you sum it up in a paragraph? Can you sum it up in a sentence? That's purpose. So we just talked about purpose. Now let's talk about your audience. So your audience is sitting on the stool, right? Your audience is sitting on the seat of that stool. And everything that you need to do, you're doing, needs to focus on your audience, because if your audience is different, your presentation should be different, right? If you're talking to third graders, that's different from talking to your mother, talking to CEOs, talking to other technology people, right? We need to know our audience. So many people try to deliver a one-size-fits-all presentation without thinking about who their audience is, and in that case, they often miss the mark, right? So who is your audience? How will you deliver what they need, right? Audiences are thinking a couple of things, right? They're thinking, picture every audience member with two thought bubbles over their head. The first one is this, the second one is this. Who knows what those are? What that stands for. The first one is, why should I care? Every audience member is sitting there, and everything you say, they're thinking, why should I care about this? The second thing they're thinking is, what's in it for me? How will this benefit from me, right? How will it benefit me? So this is why I care, this is why I'm interested in what you have to say, and here's how this will help me. In order to do that, in order to hit your target with your audience, and this is with marketing, this is with a one-on-one communication, this is in any presentation, what does your audience know? What's their level of experience and expertise? What do they care about? What are their interests and biases and assumptions, right? What do they want and need? What are they trying to achieve? What are their goals and objectives, right? If anyone watching this webinar right now, you most likely want to be a better presenter, otherwise you wouldn't be here, right? And we have people who are very experienced presenters and some people who maybe never presented in their life, right? So we have a wide range. So everything I offer today will be something that any audience member will be able to use regardless of your level of experience and expertise. So this is a sheet I often recommend people fill out. My audience is blank. Here's why they should care about what I have to say. Here's what I want them to do in terms of action, and here's how it will benefit them. If you think this through, it will help you to design and deliver a more effective presentation. So take a look at this one for a second. This is for this webinar, right? My audience is people in the testing and QA fields, right? Software development. You should care because you want to be a better presenter, otherwise you wouldn't be here. What I want you to do after this is take the tools, tips, and techniques that I give you today and actually apply them and use them so you can be better. And the what's in it for me benefit for you is that you'll be better presenters, both immediately and as you work on it over time in the future. When I first started presenting, I was not great. I was not a great presenter. I was terrified of presenting. That's a whole other conversation, is overcoming the fear and anxiety of public speaking. Believe it or not, even though I talk fast, I'm an extreme introvert, and public speaking was not something I ever thought I would do, and now I do it every single day, whether I'm teaching classes or delivering workshops, speaking, doing a keynote, or speaking on a panel, right? So I've gone from being terrified of public speaking and terrible at it over the last 10 or 15 years to doing it professionally. So if I can do it, anyone can do it. It just takes work, effort, and learning and practice, and you get better over time. So we'll talk more about that shortly. All right, so we just talked about you need to know what your purpose is, and you need to know who your audience is. Now let's start with the presentation content itself. So you need to think about, all right, what research do I need to do? For example, I was reading articles like this one about shifting left. And so I try to read a little bit about what you guys in your industry, some of the issues and challenges you're dealing with, what's the language you speak, the terminology, DevOps, Agile, testing, right? Some of the terminology that gives you credibility, but also puts you in the mindset, it helps you connect with your audience so you can envision some of the issues and challenges they're facing and the audiences that they're presenting to. Ideation is about idea generation and creating your content. And also, as I mentioned, deciding what to include and what not to include based on your purpose, your audience, and your time constraints, right? So I mentioned this before. Picture an ocean, right? think about there's an ocean of knowledge out there, everything there is to know about your subject, whether it's presenting or coding or software development, right? There's an ocean of knowledge. Here's what you know, right? You do not know everything. No one knows everything, right? So you don't know what's going on the other. If you know everything about the Atlantic, you may not know everything about the Pacific, right? So there's always an ocean of knowledge that we don't know about. But what we do know about is this iceberg. This is our own iceberg of what we know about our subject matter, right? What you'd like to cover in your next presentation might be this, right? The tip of the iceberg. But with time constraints and other limitations, you may only have time to cover this much, right? You want to do this, you can only do this. So again, you have to decide what to leave out. What's going to be most relevant and important to your audience at this point in time? So what's the core of your content, right? If you think about it, can you sum up your premise in one paragraph? Could you sum it up in one sentence, right? So you need to be able to identify in kind of an elevator pitch what it is that your presentation is about, right? So if you can set out a description of it, if you're going to tell someone this is what my presentation is about, you need to be able to narrow it down to its core, and then you build from there, okay? So that's the content piece. Again, each of these pieces is shortened based on our time constraints of today. So that was the main thing. What are you going to include and not? And now, once you decide what you're going to include in your presentation, you need to think about what's the structure going to be, in what order, right? How is it going to flow? What's the sequence and timing of the different sections? Creating your PowerPoint. And if you have handouts or materials, you need to do those as well. So we want to think about our presentations in terms of the design and the structure. We're actually building something, right? From the bottom up. So a presentation is a story, right? You're telling someone a story, you're taking them on a journey, right? Stories have a beginning, middle, and end. So our opening is how are we going to open? The middle is what are we going to talk about in the heart of the core of our presentation, and also how are we going to end it, right? How are we going to close? How are we going to conclude? We're going to talk about each of these pieces as we go along. So let's start with, and again, it's great to use tools so you're not starting with a blank sheet. So I often use this presentation design planning sheet. If you want, you can always email me. I'll send my contact information at the end of this presentation. If you want to email me, I could send you a copy of any of these tools that we talk about. So I use a sheet like this to capture my audience and purpose. Who are they? Why am I presenting? Why are they here, right? The opening, how am I going to start? I'm going to talk more about openings in a minute. Then the content, not only what I'm going to include, but what examples I'm going to use, what metaphors and analogies I'm going to use. Metaphors and analogies are great because they help to communicate your message. But a bad metaphor is actually more confusing than no metaphor, right? So we need to have a metaphor or analogy that resonates with our audience. If I'm talking about, if I give a baseball analogy, but you're from a country that where baseball is not played, then maybe I'll use a soccer analogy or a musical analogy. You need to use metaphors and analogies that resonate with your audience that will have an impact on them. And lastly, the close. How are you going to end the presentation? We're going to talk about all of these things as we go forward. So let's start with beginnings. How are you going to open your presentation? So this is where we are right now on our roadmap. How do 99% of presentations open? While you're thinking about that, let me just take a quick refresher. How do most presentations open? Unfortunately, in a very robotic way, like this. Hi, my name is, I am the blank of blank. We do X, Y, and Z. And today I'm going to talk about this. This is exactly what I did not do to open the presentation, right? I could have said, hi, my name's Todd Cherches. I'm the CEO of Big Blue Gumball. We do this, this, and this. Today I'm going to talk to you about this. I held my, if you notice, I held my bio until a little further, about 5 or 7 minutes into the workshop. What did we start with? Think about it. Started with having you think about some of the worst presentations you've ever sat through, right? So I didn't just do this. I didn't just introduce myself. I started with some content and then eased my way and wove this in seamlessly. So why do we do that? Because robotic presentations are what most people do, robotic introductions, and they're predictable and boring. And what we want to do is keep people from zoning out, falling asleep, and saying, oh, I'll wake up. I once had a presentation open, a presenter once open was saying, this is the boring part, please bear with me, right? If it's boring, why is it even in there? And no, we're not going to bear with you. Sorry, right? Make it interesting. If it's in there, it must be of some interest to you or to us, or if it's not, don't include it, right? So no one should ever have to bear with you through the boring part. Make the boring part interesting to your audience. There are ways of doing that. We'll talk more about that shortly. So how did I open this webinar? I went straight from the title slide to having you think about some of the worst presentations you've ever seen, and then we talked about the 5 biggest complaints, right? And then I introduced myself. That's just one way of doing it. It's not perfect. It's not the only way. It's just one way. So you need to find openings that work for you, but the key is don't be predictable and boring. The purpose of your opening is to do what? We said your whole presentation needs a purpose, right? But what's the purpose of your opening? 2 things. One is to set the stage, right? You're setting the stage for your presentation, and the other is you're providing a roadmap. You're leading, your presentation has a beginning, middle, and end, right? So you're taking, just like a journey does. A journey starts from a starting point, you go on a trip, and you end at your destination. That's what a presentation does, right? So you need to provide people with a roadmap. This was our roadmap for today, right? I said, here's our master model. I'm going to take you from purpose to audience to the 3 legs of the stool, and that's our roadmap for today, right? So I didn't lay it out as a roadmap. I didn't use bullet points, as you can see, right? I presented it in a visual and creative way. So that's why I encourage you to do. Do the unexpected, do the unpredictable, and people are more likely to not get bored and to be engaged in what you have to say and how you say it. So another purpose of your opening is to address the why should I care and what's in it for me that we talked about before, right from the beginning. If you want to impact your audience and influence them to do something, they're thinking, why should I care, what's in it for me? We need to address that as soon as possible. So there's 2 ways of doing this. I use the phrase, set the context and sell the value, right? Setting the context like a picture frame puts a frame around your presentation. When you set the context, today we're going to talk about this. And if you remember, even before I opened, I said to you, I have to have a confession to make that this webinar is not going to help you be a better presenter. It's only going to give you some tools, tips, and techniques, because the only way to be a better presenter is to actually present and get practice with feedback and coaching, right? So I set that context before I even really introduced the presentation. Setting the context answers the question, why should I care, right? Why should I care about this presentation? Because it's going to help me be a better presenter. And that's also the selling the value, right? If you value being a better presenter, the what's in it for me is right there. If I pay attention to what this presentation tells me, that's why I care, and here's how I will benefit, right? So what are some effective ways to open? Let's talk about that. I gave you some examples, right? So 3 classic ones. There's a lot. There's probably 20 different ways to open. So, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to give you 3 top ones, right? So you can open with a question, you can open with a story or anecdote, or you can open with an interesting statistic. Let me give you a couple of examples of these. So you can start with a literal question, like, what made the last bad presentation so bad, right? That's a literal question. I asked you and you answered, right? You can also ask a rhetorical or a question like, how many people here have ever had any kind of presentation skills training? If I was doing this live and I said show of hands, how many people raise your hand? That would give me a sense of how many people have or haven't had any kind of training before. Another type of question is a rhetorical question. So if I said, who here would like to be a better presenter? That's rhetorical. It gets you in the mindset, it helps us connect. But I'm not asking, because no one's going to say, no, I would not like to be, I'd rather be a worse presenter, right? So it's rhetorical, and that it just gets you thinking about what today is going to be about. So those are using questions, a couple of examples. A story or anecdote, right? We say everyone loves a story. Stories have a beginning, middle, and end. Let me tell you about the time. Let me tell you about the worst presentation experience of my life, right? If I told you that, and this was a presentation workshop, wouldn't you want to hear about it so you could avoid and learn from that mistake? So storytelling, anecdotes. I've heard people tell stories that have nothing to do, maybe it's a funny story, maybe it's interesting, but has nothing to do with the content of the presentation. It needs to be relevant to the subject matter, relevant to the audience, right? It seems like you shouldn't have to say that, but I've seen it done. So again, storytelling is a great way to illustrate your points and bring them to life and demonstrate your credibility as a subject matter expert in your field and what you're talking about. An interesting statistic. What if I said, based on my experience, 50% of the attendees of this webinar will use what they've learned today, and 50% of you won't? Which group will you be in, right? So right there, it gets you thinking. It's both a question, but it's also a statistic that gets you thinking, hey, I want to be in the group that does get better, as opposed to the ones who watch this webinar and then just go back to doing what I've always done. Let's say I have here's another example of statistics. Let's say I have a 250 average. I tell you I have a 250 average. Is that good or bad? It depends, right? The answer it depends is the answer to most questions or many of them, right? What does it depend on? If I'm bowling, 250 is a great average. I should be on the Pro Bowlers Tour. If I'm playing baseball, 250 is not a great batting average, right? So the number in and of itself means nothing outside of the context. So that's something, a lot of times I hear people throwing numbers around as if audiences are supposed to be impressed. But if we don't know the context of what the numbers represent, our message is lost. So think about this, whenever you communicate numbers, it's not about the numbers. It's about what the numbers mean, and it's about the story that they tell, right? And they have to be relevant to your audience. If I'm telling you about a baseball batting average again, if you know nothing about baseball, it doesn't mean anything. Same thing about bowling, right? Here's a classic example. Steve Jobs, when he announced the iPad, the introduction of the iPod in 2001, if he had said this device holds 5 gigabytes, right? To most audiences, that means nothing, right? Unless you're a technology person. If I say it holds 1,000 songs, anyone could understand that. Anyone could say, wow, that's amazing. I could call this little thing holds 1,000 songs. That's incredible. So if they said iPod holds 5 gigabytes of storage, how many people is that going to impress? Versus iPod, 1,000 songs in your pocket. Who doesn't want one, right? Now I can leave my CDs at home, my CDs, and I could carry around 1,000 songs with me on this little device. So again, know your audience, use numbers that are meaningful, right? One of the things, I recommend this book, Presentation Secrets of Steve Jobs, one of my favorite presentation books. One of the things that the author Carmine Gallo says is that Steve Jobs did not deliver a presentation, he created an experience. That's a great way to think about presentations. Are you just delivering content, or are you creating an experience that will be impactful and memorable? Another type of opening is a shock statement. So I mentioned the top 3, but one other is a shock statement. So when I open today by saying, before we start, I have a confession to make. Watching this webinar will not make you a better presenter. You might think, wait, what? That's why I'm here, to be a better presenter, right? So hopefully that, it's not necessarily shocking, like electrifying, but it kind of throws the audience off for a second, and then you respond to that by saying, however, it will help you gain some tools, tips, and techniques that when you do practice and present, you will eventually get better. So it's not just watching this webinar that will make you better, it's putting these ideas into practice to get better that will make you better, right? So again, all of these openings are a way of capturing and holding your audience's attention. So think about that. How are you going to open your next presentation? Let's get to the middle. We're just going to touch on this just a little bit. So this is the core of your content, right? So we talked about your audience and purpose, how you're going to open. Now the content piece, right? Again, you only have a short amount of time to cover. Even if you do a full day, you might have a week's worth of content, but you have to do it within a day. Sometimes you have 3 hours, sometimes you have a half hour, right? Sometimes you have 15 minutes, right, or less. So you need to think about the core of your content. So one of the things to do is, how am I going to break everything I know so people don't, there's a saying that you should drip on people, but don't drown them, right? Sometimes we overload people with too much information. So we need to break our information down into bite-sized pieces. And sometimes our presentation only has enough for 1 piece, sometimes 3 pieces, sometimes the whole candy bar, right? But you need to, if you can break it down to bite-sized pieces, you can decide how much is digestible, for lack of a better pun, or metaphor, how much is digestible for your audience to absorb. Another tip is to link the content of your presentation to your audience's existing knowledge, right? So think about, what do my audiences already know? If they're experts in the field, you may not need to go through some of the basics, but if you're presenting to, say, a non-technology audience, you may need to go back a second and define your terms. That's a key point to keep in mind too. Jargon, acronyms, technology, always define it if you're not sure if your audience knows what you're talking about. If you're just throwing acronyms around, you're more likely to confuse people than to inform them. Highlighting. You talk about a lot of things, right? But sometimes it's good, often it's good to highlight the key points. Sometimes during the middle, sometimes at different increments throughout your presentation, or sometimes at the end. This way it identifies for your audience. If you take, I talked for a half hour, but if you were just gonna take one thing away from today's presentation, this is what it should be. It's up to you to highlight that for your audience. Now, so take a look at the last few slides I just showed you. What do all these images have in common? You have an iceberg, a candy bar, a chain link fence, an apple, a highlighter, right? So if you notice, there's not a lot of text here at all. They're all visual metaphors that help illustrate the point. So what I did was I talked about the concept, while using a visual image that represented the concept. So hopefully you were listening, and that each of the visual images that I showed you will help resonate with you. So hopefully next time you see a Hershey bar at the candy counter, they'll say, oh yeah, that reminds me of Todd's presentation. I need to break it down to bite-sized pieces. Or keep an apple out on your desk and say, what's the core of my content, right? Let's talk about endings. How are you going to close your presentation, right? This is how many presentations open, just like close. Just like a lot of presentations open with, hi, my name is, a lot of presentations close with, whoops, we're out of time. Thanks for coming, right? Do not do that. What's the downside of doing that? One, you didn't manage your time effectively. And two, you're missing out on an opportunity, a great opportunity to close with impact. Research has shown that people tend to remember the first and last things they read or hear, right? So you want to kind of bookend your presentation, bring it full circle, close the loop, leave people on a powerful high note with the last thing you say. Saying, oops, we're out of time, and then the tape cuts off, or you're escorted off the stage, you lost an opportunity to close your presentation with impact and influence. So how can you close? What are some ways of closing? Here are a few. One is you could take the different types of openings and also use them as closings, right? So let's say I presented everything today and I closed with, so based on everything we talked about today, what is one thing, just one, this is with the picture of the highlighter, what is one thing you're gonna do differently today or in your next presentation based on what we talked about today? So we talked about, I probably gave you 20 different tips. You can't do 20 different things, right? Pick one, start with one. What's the one thing you're gonna do differently? Boom, close, right? That's one way of ending. Or you can end with a story or anecdote, right? As my boss once said to me after one of my worst presentations, right? Right there, as soon as you start with in conclusion, or as someone once said to me, the audience piques their attention, and it's a nice way to close on a powerful high note. An interesting statistic. We found over the years that if you just spend 20% more time preparing, you can increase your overall effectiveness by 80%. Again, that's the 80-20 rule in action. So again, it's a statistic, it's impactful, and it closes with power and with punch. Those are a couple of keywords in the presentation field. So here's the thing. When you close your presentation, it needs to have a call to action, right? We mentioned that earlier. What do you want people to think, feel, know, and most importantly, do at the end of your presentation, right? When we talk about thinking, we want to change people's perspective, right? Change their perception. Oh, I hadn't thought about that before. I'm now thinking about this in a whole new way. Feeling, you want people to feel like, hey, I need to change. If you want to influence people, you need to get their buy-in. You need to say them, have them be thinking to themselves and feeling, I really need to do this. I really need to take this action. I really need to do what they recommend. And also know, what do you want them to know? What do you want to inform them? Sometimes you can't give them every piece of information they need, but you can give them a book recommendation, leave them with an article, give them some tools that will increase their knowledge base. And then lastly, what do you want them to do? What action do you want them to take when they leave? Is it follow up with you? Is it try, buy a new software package? It's like, what do you want them to do differently? If you're trying to influence someone to shift left, right? Instead of going analyze, design, develop, test, and release, you want them to shift testing to earlier in the process. You need to say, here, this is what I think, this is how I feel, and how hopefully they feel the same way. Now they know what you're talking about, and you leave them thinking, you know what, maybe we need to do this. Maybe in what ways can we move testing up sooner in the process so that we can maximize the benefit of this recommendation, right? So those are some things to think about. There's also an acronym called AIDA, A-I-D-A. You want to make the audience aware. You want to capture their interest. You want to get them to desire or want to do something. And then you want them, that last A is the action. So that's just another tool I want to throw out there is the AIDA, A-I-D-A, action, interest, desire, action. Awareness, interest, desire, action. That will hopefully spur them to do something differently. So think about your next presentation and how are you going to close it with impact and influence. So we've walked through this whole presentation sheet, right? Audience and purpose, open, content, and close. And now let's talk a little bit about delivery. We could do a whole workshop on delivery, right? It's about, you've done everything we've talked about so far was all about before your presentation. But once you set foot on the stage, or once the webinar clock starts, all bets are off, right? You need to do what you plan to do. You need to execute, right? So planning is one thing, execution is another. So as we talk about delivery, how are you going to prepare to present? You need to think about body language, facial expression, tone of voice, voice modulation, pace. Again, I'm probably talking faster than I should, right? I have my snail here. Reminds me to slow down and breathe, but no matter what, I still have so much to say and I'm so passionate about my topic, I tend to talk really fast. So I'm going to slow it down for a second. Breathe, relax, right? And think about, how am I going to deliver my presentation in a way that will have the greatest impact? What's the value of pausing? What's the value of stopping for a second, taking a breath, letting your audience catch their breath, right? There's some concept called cognitive load. People can just take in so much information. This is a 1-hour webinar, but what if it was a 3-hour webinar? What if I was talking nonstop for 3 hours? Well, would that be better or worse? In a lot of cases, less is more when it comes to presenting, because there's just so much the human brain can take in and that people will remember. I often think about the words attention, comprehension, and retention. Attention is how you're going to get people to focus. Comprehension is how you're going to get people to understand what you're talking about. And retention is how you're going to get people to remember. One of the best ways is through visuals. Another way is through jargon and acronyms that you define, like AIDA or others, right? So let's talk a little bit about delivery. So when you're delivering a presentation, my #1 rule is the rule of 3. Practice, practice, practice. Because that's the only way we get better at anything, right? It seems obvious, right? But how many times do we not practice? It's one thing to run through it in your head. It's another thing to speak it out loud. It's another thing to do it in front of it. Set up your phone, set up your iPhone on a tripod and videotape yourself doing the presentation to see how you come across, right? I practiced this presentation probably 3 or 4 times before actually I'm delivering it to you right now as a webinar. I designed it, and each time I practice it, I tweaked it. Some things I said, oh, that's too long. Other times I said, oh, this needs a better visual. So in the process of practicing, I did some editing, I did some revamping, right? So it's very rare that we get anything right on the first try. So I would say preparation, 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 and practice, practice, practice. Those are the keys to delivering a presentation, designing and delivering a presentation that will have impact and that will influence people. So in closing, I'm going to start to wrap up now. So I'm going to just pause a little bit. So I'm going to start to close out the presentation. So think about what I might say in my closing. How can I bring this full circle? How am I going to get you to think, feel, and know with leaning towards do, right? So what I want you to do, I want you to watch this webinar, but also take some notes, do some things differently, right? So in closing, I would say if you want to impact and influence your audience, the single most important thing you can do is focus on these 2 things. Any guesses what those 2 things are based on the presentation today? Your purpose and your audience, right? So often we say, oh, I have to do this webinar, or I have to deliver this presentation, or I have to deliver this, I have a meeting with my boss where I have to present where we are, right? We jump right into the content. We jump right into, here's my content, I designed it, now I'm going to deliver it. But we don't stop and pause and think, what's my purpose? Who's my audience? What do they know? What do they want? Why should I care? What's in it for them? And what's my goal? What's my purpose? What do I want to achieve at the end of this presentation? And even think about that for an Agile Scrum, right? You're meeting in the morning, everyone's talking about what they did yesterday, what they're going to do today, what the obstacles are in their way, right? You're thinking about, who am I talking to? Who are the other people in this room? Are they going to understand what I'm talking about? Do I need to give them some backstory, or do they know exactly what I'm talking about? And also, what's my purpose? It's to inform them, right? To inform people, but it's also to let them know how they can help you possibly, right? Here are some obstacles I might face. If anyone has any tips, please let me know, right? So in any communication, whether it's a one-on-one or a small group or in a large auditorium, we always have to be thinking about our purpose and our audience, because that's going to inform the content we choose to use, how we design it, and how we deliver it. So a few things as we start to wrap up. One is, here's my contact information. Feel free to link in with me. Feel free to email me with any questions. I'm always happy to help people. I'm based in New York City, so again, management, leadership training, presentation skills, executive coaching. Feel free to reach out anytime. I could be of value to you. Also, here are some of my top presentation books. These are the books that helped to teach me everything I taught you today, right? The Naked Presenter by Gar Reynolds. It's beautifully written. All of these books are visual. That's the thing I want to say, first of all. So The Naked Presenter is my #1. I always say that's my #1 book recommendation if you want to, whether you're presenting with slides or without. They talk about everything from making your presentations engaging, openings and closings. It's just by far my best, my #1 recommendation. Gar Reynolds' other book, Presentation Zen. Great book if you want for PowerPoint design, structuring your presentation, designing it, and delivering it. So Presentation Zen is a little more technical. Naked Presenter is more about philosophies and also tools, tips, and techniques for presenting. So I recommend both of them, but if I had to pick one, it would be The Naked Presenter, although Zen is the best for your slides. Similarly, Slideology by Nancy Duarte. Nancy Duarte and Gar Reynolds are like the king and queen of presentations. They changed my life in terms of how I think about things from a visual perspective. So Slideology is about creating better slides, and Resonate is about storytelling. She uses a lot of classic examples, for example, Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, and she breaks them down and talks about how we could be better storytellers. So I love all 4 of those books on the top row. I mentioned The Presentation Secrets of Steve Jobs by Carmine Gallo. He's one of the top presentation skills gurus out there. If you Google Presentation Secrets of Steve Jobs by Carmine Gallo on YouTube, you'll find a video where he walks you through the 16 things that Steve Jobs did to help make his presentations engaging and impactful and make him one of the best presenters of our generation. So in addition to the book, check out the video, which actually shows you examples of Jobs' presentations. I love 100 Things Every Presenter Needs to Know About People. Great for really anything, whether it's leadership or presenting, but it's a great book about how to get in the mindset of other people. Exceptional Presenter is good, and also Dale Carnegie, he's one of the all-time gurus of public speaking, and he wrote the book, How to Win Friends and Influence People in 1936. So another great resource. So again, we don't get better just by reading these things, but reading these things help put us in a mindset and make us think about things that we need to work on that maybe we hadn't thought about before. I mentioned before, The Naked Presenter is my #1 recommendation. And in Presentation Zen and The Naked Presenter, Gar Reynolds, who's actually an American who lives in Japan, he takes a Zen approach to everything he does. And he always keys on the 3 keywords: simplicity, clarity, and brevity, right? Keep things as simple as possible, make things as clear as possible, and make things as brief as possible. Sometimes, oftentimes, less is more. With that, speaking of simplicity, I'll leave you with this final quote by Da Vinci, that simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. It's not about taking things and dumbing it down. It's about finding the core and the essence of what we want people to know and simplifying it in a way that will get people to think, feel, know, and ultimately to do. So with that, I thank you for being here. And we're going to continue the conversation on Slack. Vera?
Thank you all for participating in Presenting with Impact and Influence with Todd Cherches. As mentioned at the beginning, we hope to see you at our conference Contest NYC taking place for November 14th through 16th in New York City. We'll be moving over to Slack for the Q&A portion of this webinar, and you can find it in the events channel. Thank you, everyone.
Great, thank you, everyone.